and hopefully it'll work.
Okay.
Hi. Okay. Hello, everyone in participatory media and social practice. As I promised, here is an interview that I am doing with Jessica Maria Ross, the co-creator of Saving the Sierra and Restore Restory, which I hope you read about in the Boom interview because it's a fantastic interview. And what I want to do is just ask Jessica to start off by giving you a real sense of what it was like to both design, produce, and get funding for that project in basically 2006, 2007, and then see it through until it's, I guess, what would we call it, Jessica? Not, it's ending in, or it's,
we call it, we've let it drift.
It's drift in 2010, right?
No, it started drifting in 2009.
Okay, so let's talk about the really kind of peak moments of when the project was living both online and in real life throughout the Sierra, because also I wanted to share with you because several people here actually do come from rural areas and have always been interested in how digital media plays out within places that are very widely dispersed and possibly don't have access or interest in pulling together community through media online. So why don't we start with that and, you know, give us your sort of sense looking backwards of Saving the Sierra and how it's brought you to where you're at now.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. And I guess a couple things I would say is that Catherine Stifter, the co-director of the project, and I got together and met for the first time actually on the Yuba River in the Sierra in August of 2005. And we decided we wanted to do this project, and so we spent, I want to mention this because a lot of people, this is kind of some backstory that I think maybe people don't think about, but basically we spent 4 solid months writing the funding proposal. So that's like our first whole step of work, which involves connecting not only to each other as co-creators, but to possible stakeholders, possible partner organizations. And so we got our funding in mid-December of 2005 to have a 3-year project from 2006 to 2009. And what we did is we designed this project to kind of do 2 things. One was to enable rural residents up and down the Sierra Nevada who by and large don't have broadband to be able to network and share stories and meet and work together around what they're doing to champion the places they love. And have then also some kind of mechanism for these rural residents to reach their downstream counterparts in suburban and urban areas. Here in California, and I think across the country, it's those suburban and urban areas that have the population base that ultimately control the fate of rural areas.
So and Catherine is also a journalist.
Catherine is a 2-time Peabody Award-winning journalist. She's well respected in public radio. She's kind of at the top of that game, and she also lives in the Sierra. And I live downstream. I live in the Central Valley. So we tried to create a project that kind of modeled what it is that we were exploring, which is how do people in urban and rural areas come together to understand what we all have at stake in stewarding our resources, or the resources of the Sierra Nevada, which is where in California we get 2/3 of our water from the Sierra. It's where all the carbon sequestration is for having our clean air. It's of course, you know, where the jewels of Yosemite and Lake Tahoe, where people go for their recreation and spiritual connection, all those kinds of things. Anyway, so I would say that we designed the project in collaboration with 3 community partners, 4 at the end, And Helen, let me just touch base. I'm going to give you kind of a broad overview, right? Because specifics they can get on the site.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about any of the specifics. Okay. Really what we want to find out too is how, that you did collaborate, but then also how you flowed back and forth between a relatively new multimedia environment and your face-to-face public engagement.
Right.
Take us to some of these student questions.
Right. So, so in terms of building the project, in 2005, the term transmedia was not being bandied about, nor was the term multi-platform storytelling. As far as I understand, it really came about more around 2008, which is when we had already wrapped up all of our production at that point. So one of the things I would tell you in response to your question, Helen, is at the time we didn't realize it, but what we were doing was kind of on the frontier of where public media and interactive documentary have gone. It seems funny, it's not that long ago, but in internet time, everything we did was so long ago. So I would say in our project, the first 6 months, one of the things about our project is that we really turned the traditional public media model on its head. Usually in public media, what one does is, as journalists, you figure out what story you want to tell, you figure out your sources, your angles, you go get all that information, make your product, and then figure out how you're going to put it out in the world, usually through some legacy media like PBS or NPR. What we did instead is we built the whole engagement into the front end of the project. So our first 6 to 8 months, which was way longer than we thought it was going to be, was just building the collaborations with our partners and figuring out how we could start talking to people in the Sierra. And that ended up in this design of a mobile story booth that went up and down, which is on the site. The second, so that's part of the design, engagement up front in collaborations and building collaborations. The second part was engagement with people on the ground to help actually do our research and inform the project. Again, that was very untraditional at the time. So for the second 6 months, we went up and down the Sierra, invited people to share stories, edited them, and we built this website and put it online. And again, building a website back in that time that was moderately interactive, that was all about having people be able to share their own stories. It's laughable now, but it was really out of the box. Because if we were getting funding to make an NPR hour-long documentary special, it's like, where's the documentary special? So, so the key part of the piece about the design that I would point out is that, again, if we're trying to get rural folks to be able to speak to each other up and down the Sierra, and they're not able to do that on the ground, because in the Sierra, like a lot of places, the transportation routes are east-west. It's all about going in and getting the resources and bringing them back out of it.
Oh.
So it takes longer. My colleague, Catherine, who lives in the Sierra, I can almost always get anywhere in the Sierra faster than her because I just go up main freeways and get there, whereas she has to go on all these curvy roads. So we're going to use the internet to cross those geographic boundaries. So so I'll tell you the third piece, and then I'll circle back to why we use audio and how it connects rural residents and how that led to different kinds of engagement. The third piece was after we got all of these stories up, we recorded about 100 stories. We were able to edit 80 of them. We put them up on the site. That launched the site. The site started getting just an intense amount of use. We had about 300 unique visits a week early on, and throughout the project, we had into our drift phase, and a year after we stopped even doing anything on the site, we had 100 unique visits a week. And what that was is all of these people who had told their story going on and sending it to somebody else.
So they spread it. They kept spreading it.
Right, and that was part of the design. and because you can spread audio on rural networks without broadband. You can't do video. Video was out from the beginning. Our earlier website, we transitioned the website later to a Flash, but the early website was a little bit different. It's something I can circle back to in some of the student questions. A lot of what happens when you're designing your platforms is about who are you trying to involve as makers, and who are you trying to involve as users, and that's going to determine, and then what resources you have. And that's going to really determine, what technology you're going to use. So let's see, the last part of what we did is based on what we heard up and down the Sierra and some conversations with our collaborators. We figured out a topic for an hour-long documentary, public radio documentary, that would resonate not just across California, but across the country. And then we spent the time, gathering those stories, producing it, and then in 2008, we did our Earth Day documentary special. And then following that, we had a series of listening sessions and worked with all of our collaborators and then all the people who started approaching us to find ways that they could use all of this media that was readily available to them on this website. We essentially created this website, which also had a blog, by the way, so people were connecting that way. So we created this website that served for multiple entry points and multiple uses. And it had kind of the gravitas because it had a whole public media component. We did feature stories for the California Report. We did this hour-long documentary special. It was played on over 200 stations nationwide, Canada, Australia, so people, that's a big deal in public radio. And then we had all these community stories that people were using up and down. And so the last part of our project in 2008 into 2009 was just responding to requests and ideas about how to use this website. So that was kind of, the three-part design, getting collaborators, both organizations and storytellers there, stakeholders involved from the get-go, creating a platform where all of those stories and research and ideas can be out there in the beginning and used. And then based on what we discovered and learned in our relationships, designing our public radio documentary and then coming in at the back end and finding ways to bring all of those groups together using the website where you can download everything, and there's a discussion guide, and there's more to the story, but that's essentially it.
That's so interesting because I think what we're finding in 2013, and this is not just with this class, is people get annoyed, Jessica, that it's not live right now. Like,
yeah,
how come they're not doing it anymore? We want to be, interacting and being part of the blog, and surely they're still able to make it work.
Well, it's a really interesting challenge to think about for everybody, and I've approached a couple of foundations about this. I mean, the only reason the site is even up is because Catherine and I pay for it. One of the big issues that people need to think about now that we're moving towards the internet as not only our exhibition platform, but our archival platform, is that actually someone's got to fund that. And you get kind of some of the responses that you mentioned, Helen, which is, the design, the feel, the navigation. I mean, that's all very 2007. Because that was like the frontier in 2007. But like I said, internet years are like dog years, And so by 2008, it's already 7 years behind. In 2009, 14 years behind. And the other thing, too, that's different about what we did and now is that, when we were doing this work, we got one grant. That's it. We got our initial grant. We thought, we're hot shit. This is awesome. This is new. This is groundbreaking. And after that, nobody could understand what we were doing. There were, are you journalists? Are you activists? Are you artists? Why is it on the internet? What kind of thing? I mean, it was so hybrid at the time, and hybridity was, you don't fit any boxes, so we can't fund you. And that's changed a lot. But still, there's a big issue for all of us to keep in mind, because if you look at like some of these gorgeous, beautiful sites, like anything from the National Film Board,
which they're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big issues that my friends and I are talking about is, in some ways, we're kind of reverting to like a Hollywood model. Like if you look at an National Film Board credit sheet, all of the people and all of the money, it reads like a Hollywood film. And there's no independent media maker has that kind of funding to do that level of interactivity and immersion. I mean, their stuff is so show-stopping.
Have you seen Bear 71?
It's one of my favorites. But the thing is, I almost get depressed, because I think, how in the world could an independent media maker raise whatever it is, $2 million to make a site like that?
Like Bear 71.
Yeah. Or any of their stuff. I mean, if you just look at if you don't know about what it takes to do this stuff, which is massive, just look at the sheer number of people and compare that to the credit roll after any TV show or Hollywood film. And it's not that much different. So the question becomes, it's kind of like when MTV came out. I know it's probably way before the time of most of your students, but all of a sudden when MTV came out, there was this pressure for everything to look slick and be amazing. But we don't have the resources to do that unless you're some big corporation. And so it's hard when you show up to all of these amazing festivals and conferences, and they hold out Bear 71 and High Rise, and or some of the great stuff that like Sharon Daniel or other UC professors are doing that in collaboration with like MIT. And it's like, right, they have funding for their job, then they have funding for this project. And I just think that we need to be realistic if we're working with independent media makers or even public radio stations or media stations, because it's not like they just have that money floating around to do these big projects. It's going to mean that there's a lot of fundraising involved.
Yeah, that is a really good point, and we're going to pick up on that later, because I think that relates to some of the student questions, because one of the hardest things when you're beginning in this area is how to discern exactly what is appropriate for whatever is the project you want to do.
Yeah.
And using National Film Board projects as examples, it has to be there because they're like the luxury liners on the ocean, right? But at the same time, another really good analogy is they're like Cadillacs from 1962.
Yeah.
And someone else brought up, I brought up an essay by someone to the class, I hope they read it, called Subcompact Publishing, which is all about how the guy makes an analogy between how the Japanese cars kind of overtook American cars by the end of the 60s, but they were sort of laughed at and mocked. But the idea is, what is your means? How simple can you be? How transparent?
Yeah.
And what is the point of these online sites? Because another big point that came out, and this is going to lead us right into public engagement, is people continuously in the class say, wow, I never knew about any of these projects.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think about the National Film Board projects and think, you're right. How would I know about them?
Right.
Unless I knew about them. So,
well, it's interesting because
what is the point? Where are they going? Why are we doing this?
Oh gosh, I love this. This is
all
kind
right.
of stuff that keeps me up at night, and that I'm thinking about all the time, because all of these projects, anytime you're collaborating with other organizations or a creative partner or stakeholders, you become wedded to them, on some level. So you start having like these multiple partners on these deep commitment ways, the project, the partners, the
emotional.
Yeah, and so it takes a lot of energy and a lot of resources and a lot of time. And so it becomes really important to figure out, like, okay, what's the point? Who's actually gonna, what difference is this gonna make in people's lives and worlds? Mine, and the other people involved. And I think that's just a really good question to have as you go forward, because the kind of beautiful part and the scary part, I think, of this field is that it's a bit like quicksand, in that as you go into it, all of a sudden you feel kind of sucked in because there's so much to know. There's so many moving parts. Technology keeps changing. Funding is a challenge. And like quicksand, if you try and get out of it quick or try and figure things out too fast, you actually sink. What you have to do if you ever get in quicksand, which hopefully anybody will, is you have to actually remain calm. You have to kind of figure out a way to float. And I don't know. I just put that out there because I think that you have to choose wisely what you're going to dedicate essentially your life to in these projects.
I think that is so beautifully said, because I often reflect to myself on how did I get involved in a project that's been going on for 4 years? Where did that come from? Why?
Yeah.
What am I doing? I felt like I was out at sea.
Yep, and I pulled in. And that's kind of the thing to think about in getting to some of the student questions, is that oftentimes one of the things, one student asked a question about how you know when things are working, and I have some responses to that, but one response is when it starts to seem catalytic. So in other words, when you start to feel like you're excited, like it's really lifting you up, like you want to lean in, and that there's so much more you want to do and that can be done, that's one sign that it's working. But then it also means that you're going deeper.
Well, both of us have had that experience, you specifically with Restore Restory, and I with Ledge Love Community. And some of the part of that project I noticed that you're talking about has been sort of a pulling away from frantic production and PR and marketing or outreach, whatever you want to say, and pulling away into saying, okay, this is 2012. What are we doing? Why are we doing this? Where is this going? What's different now than it was 2 years ago when we started this? Let's try to keep the shelf life active and move with the subject as well. And, find a very deliberate way of dealing with closure.
Mm-hmm.
And that took time. That took a lot of time that I didn't think it was. And then the relationships, like you said.
They're everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything. The meetings, the emails, the social media, and so on. And then if you don't have an online community manager person, you have to do it. Of course you do, because you are the creator, right? You can't really outsource that easily.
Right. Something I would say, just to circle back, because I think some of the folks in your class are looking at public media or doing strategic communication. And I would say that my observation, since I'm working in public radio inside a station right now and launching and leading their community engagement initiative, is that I feel like there's a really strong sense within the public media system that a reinvention is underway, and that the stations, it actually wasn't really started. It was started outside stations, I think, by like AIR, the organization AIR, and some of their
like
projects.
Local Lore.
Exactly. But I think that stations are realizing that, and especially with this economic downturn, people give less. And so there's an idea of public media stations are doing, I think, some serious consideration around how do we demonstrate our value, and how are we really kind of a vibrant and relevant public service. And I think one of the ideas that I've been putting forward is we become more valued, more relevant, and more vibrant by putting the public more in public media. We've got solid journalists and solid administrators and a 40-year track record of doing really solid investigative reporting and daily talk shows and a few other things that most stations do. So what we can do going forward is find ways to bring, different stakeholders and publics into our news gathering or documentary or talk show processes, editorial decisions, making of stories, or use of the story. And that is all community engagement.
And so that's kind of not so extractive.
If you do it well.
Well, let's get to some of these questions now.
Yeah.
Someone said, by now that you have had plenty of projects under your belt to prove you can map out, produce, and plan and curate a really kick-ass program, but she is curious how you gain the trust of both the organizations you work with in order to get buy-in, and how you gain the trust of stakeholders involved. What do you feel are the key components, kind of quickly, in getting stakeholders to participate? That's one of the big, giant questions you've dealt with.
Right. Okay, so there are two different groups, right? Collaborating organizations and stakeholders, or they can be two different groups. So I'm just going to interpret that as organizations and also residents who are sharing their stories with you. Let me take that in terms of key components. Let me talk about maybe key methods. Overall, what's probably the most important thing is to spend the time and engage in a sustained process of getting to know one another, both formally and informally. So a lot of people do the formal thing, right? They have meetings. That will only, some of the things that the question talks about is building trust. And a lot of that is about building rapport and actually forming a sense of that person and you can rely on them. And also you like them, like you want to do things with them and you trust them. So that takes time and a lot of informal meetings, attending their events, attending gatherings, having some lunches, having them over to one of your dinner parties if you do that, going on walks, whatever it is. But it's kind of like it's important to remember that as the maker, you are going to be relying on them. So they need to gain your trust as well. And so you can think about it like if you're meeting a new friend or new colleague and you're thinking about doing a project together, what is it that you need to feel in your bones or hear in your mind for you to say, I want to work with this person? And what then would you need to do to generate that? So maybe here are a couple of key methods, knowing that you're going to just have to spend a lot of time. Which is important because if you're working in journalism with quick turnarounds, this is not the model for you. One thing I would recommend is that you involve people from the start, organizations, storytellers, in envisioning and designing the project. And that means from the get-go, they have a sense that you're inviting them to kind of make sure that whatever is happening addresses their interests, their concerns, their needs, their goals, their capacity. So you got to involve people from the start or as close to the start as possible.
And you're telling public media to be thinking in these ways.
Oh, yeah. That's the big struggle I had in the last 6 months.
I have a really hard time believing that they can even hear you as professionals.
Yeah, well, that's another conversation.
Okay, so move on.
And we can go there, too.
No.
I'll just finish these key components for this question. The other is you're going to want to find agreement on editorial control and how the stories are going to be used and where, and any benefits or concerns that might come up through the process. Benefits are really important. I don't think it's good to assume people will understand how this might benefit them. But also concerns are important. If you're doing any kind of work that might actually put somebody in harm's way, however unintentionally, that's got to be communicated so people can make an informed decision about whether they're going to participate. Anything that's on the web is completely uncontrollable. So making sure people know who's got editorial control, how the stories will be used and where, and any way they'll benefit from that, and how you benefit from that, because that's really important. If you're getting paid and they're not, there's got to be some clarity around how they're benefiting, how it's useful to them, and same around issues, because there's a lot usually at stake for you. You're usually going into debt. That's not true. You're not usually, but there's a lot of things that are hard and challenging for you that's important to put on the table, and if it's hard and challenging for them, that just gets on the table. So that's another component or methodological thing I'd recommend. I would also say that it's really important to be very clear about goals, roles, responsibilities, and activities, and I always codify that in an MOU and have people sign it, so that it's not something like, oh, we talked about this, don't you remember, or can you dig up this email? I actually, like on my last project, I had a celebration moment in the meeting where all 10 partners in the coalition signed the plan that we came up with and took pictures, and we had sparkling apple juice. So it's like, it's very clear. And, at one point when one of the partners started like not doing their share, I was able to call up, like, here's what we agreed to, here's what's in the MOU. I mean, it's not enforceable, but when people have gone through the process, when they know they're going to sign something, they read it. And if they read it and forget it, and you kind of call them out on, hey, you signed this, and they remember the ceremony of it, oh, they came back in. They came back to the table.
But they helped write that MOU.
Yeah.
You didn't just present it to them and then
No, it was like, oh God, it was a 1.5 month long process, and probably two convenings and 3 meetings. Yeah, I mean, this stuff takes time. That's the
Say that again to everybody. This stuff takes time.
It does, which means if you don't have a lot of time, go back to your idea, Helen, which is how do you design something that's very simple and elegant so that you can still involve people, but in a way that fits your resources. And then the last piece I'd say is, you really need to check in on a regular basis. So I hold monthly meetings. I send monthly updates. People don't always make it to every meeting. I don't know if they're reading the updates. I probably could use something like MailChimp to be able to see if they're doing that. That would be a good idea. But what it does do is almost every time there's been an issue, it comes back to me at a meeting or because they're responding to one of my monthly update emails. So it just creates this
feedback loop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I say for the person who wants to know about the key components, involve people from the beginning, find agreement on kind of game changer, deal breaker kind of things, communicate clearly, and check in regularly.
Well, I mean, that kind of answers several of these questions that people had brought up, but let's see. Another interesting one is, when do you know the collaboration and community engagement you were hoping to incorporate into a project is actually happening? You feel it? Or you look at your MOU?
I feel it. So I loved that question. I saw that question. I love actually all these questions. I actually wrote little notes, and I feel like this is helping me get clear about my own process and thinking. So it's very useful to me. So what I jotted down when I was thinking about that question, I jotted down 3 things. The first is kind of direct and informal feedback. So this is what people are kind of saying to you, what they're writing to you, how they will tend to start saying, giving you cues by saying like what's working for them, what they like, and you'll also start hearing people say how this is having an impact in their organization or in their life. So it's a lot of storytelling, which is why it's important to have these monthly meetings. And by the way, I get that direct and informal feedback because I design into my meetings these kinds of team building, storytelling types of activities where that stuff is lifted up so that I can hear every month how things are going.
And can you describe, you know, just one of those activities, for example?
So, so right now, this project I'm working on, we're having 30 community dialogues around San Joaquin County that are using all of these stories that were co-created by local youth and professionals. For Capital Public Radio. Yeah. So 209. So if you go, if you just Google 209 Talk.
No, it's on our course blog.
Yeah. So so at our community meeting yesterday, I had everybody go. I posed the question and said, I asked for people if they wanted to share like one of the most exciting moments in the dialogue that they've had so far. And, you know, then people start saying, so they'll start telling stories about like, you know, what somebody said or what someone did or how they were so amazed. They didn't realize how many people were, weren't comfortable writing in English. They wanted to write in Spanish, even though they spoke in English, but they wrote, we have these reflection action forms we're using. And how they wrote all over, they're giving me all sorts of feedback about how the process is working or not working for them, what they're appreciating about it. I can see in how their body language is, like if it's great. And that leads me to ask them too, did anybody have any challenges? And then people can talk about the challenges and we can address them right there in the meeting. So that's an example where you're just doing these kind of prompts, these storytelling prompts. Then give you a lot of anecdotal information. Of course, I type like a mad woman. You can also do direct but formal feedback. So right now I'm designing a survey that each of these partners, it's like a 10-question SurveyMonkey survey, but I will then ask them key questions and get that as part of my evaluation. And so I think it's really important to have not just this informal taking the pulse on a regular basis, but I think all these projects have to have a formal, I think if you can, it's ideal to have evaluation throughout your project. So that's another way I know it's working. I'm getting, I do a midterm survey, I do an end of project survey, and I get actual written data. Because people will have different things they think about if they have the time to reflect and put it down versus what comes up in a meeting bouncing off other people. And then the last thing is what I mentioned before. When you start to feel that the project is effortless and engaging for you, you can imagine, like you're holding a dinner party for all sorts of folks that you don't know very well. In the beginning, you're like, oh, is the food going to be good? And do I have enough place settings? And will people like each other? And where will they sit? And then at a certain point, you notice someone's doing the dishes for you. And people are like engaged in some conversation. You thought they might not like each other. You start to, that's what you feel. You're like, people are stepping up and stepping in, and you see that, and you are feeling more drawn in. I think those are ways you know when it's working.
That is, soul affirming, because at the same time, you're using techniques that are often very difficult for artists to deal with, evaluating all along, dealing with conflict, right? Calling people out on things. Do you find that you're pretty special when it comes to working in this way? Or have you felt you've really turned it into part of your practice?
Well,
is this for everybody?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess what I think is that I come to documentary and art making from a community organizing background. And I think that's fundamentally different than artists and journalists coming to this from a news gathering or creative self-expression background. And so I think what's unique about my situation is that my practice is not a stretch for me. It's actually my default. What that means, though, is I have to work harder at being a good storyteller. I have to work harder at recognizing and honoring my own creative work and making that be part of the project, not just it be about for, the folks I'm working with. So it cuts both ways, but I would say that if there's advice I would give to folks who are interested in this area, which I do think has a incredibly vibrant future, is to, in addition to whatever training or coursework people are taking, to actually do some workshops and training in community development and community organizing. Because I think those are the fundamental practices that really enable successful projects.
Wow, that is really a surprise. That is very interesting that you say that, because that is really what we're talking about in participatory media. It sounds like to me is the idea of social practice is truly a kind of developmental practice.
Yeah, and so I should also probably say, as I was hearing myself say that, it does also depend on where you are in this continuum, because like I noticed that you had Saving the Sierra alongside Sharon Daniels' work, and Kat Zizek's work. And
you mean High Rise?
Yeah, and I think that, for someone like...
They're all very different.
Yeah, right. So that's what I mean. I think that, this is a little bit of a generalization, but if you look at a continuum, I think in terms of artistic creative self-expression based on a collaborative relationship, but fundamentally about being kind of an artistic and an art
world oriented.
Yeah, and also in terms of who's it for, who's got editorial control, and how it will be used. I think maybe Sharon Daniels is on one end. I think I'm kind of on the other, where, I don't have the funding or necessarily the chops yet to make these amazingly beautiful pieces. But I'm also much more focused on the process and the impact and use of them. And then I think Kat is in the middle. Yeah, High Rise, if you look at her earlier work.
I haven't seen her earlier work.
So her early work when she was an artist in residence in a St. John's mental hospital. Yeah, her early work with homeless.
Is it online?
Yeah. It's all online. It's all NFB, so it's all very resource, but it was much more, I think High Rise, is, it's her latest work, but all of her earlier work that I have seen is much more focused on engaging people in making their stories and using them and sharing them. So I think she's kind of in the middle.
Well, I'm going to ask you two more questions, and maybe you've already answered this, is what advice would you give to the students about finding an ideal way to create a participation platform? What platform do you know works best for the project?
Right. Well, I think this is where we can learn a lot from the design field. Designers fundamentally think about their work, at least the designers that I've had the opportunity to work with, they think about their work in terms of having a challenge. And they usually kind of ask a couple of questions like, who are you aiming to involve? again, as makers or users. What mediums do those people use or have access to? You know, how you reach, what's the easiest way to reach them or for them to reach each other? And then what resources do you have? And I think that when you answer those questions, it all of a sudden starts to become clearer what you can do. And, you know, circling back to working in rural areas, which is primarily what I've done the last 10 years, it's a really different ballgame. You know, video is still really hard to use. You know, a lot of rural areas do not have broadband, so you are not going to be using video. You know, end of story. So that's a challenge. Also, if you're working in rural areas, you know, it's hard for people to come together. They're often driving half hour, an hour if it's in winter. I mean, there's just all of these other things that come into play if in terms of who you're trying to involve, how you can get them together, and then what they're interested in. You know, I did end up doing a video project, a rural video project, where I worked with not my typical constituency. They were all over 55 white ranchers. And, you know, we were doing these digital stories, which are, you know, audio narration with, they're kind of like audio slideshows, audio narration with...
Like Center for Digital Storytelling.
Yeah. So, and it was really hard for these folks to, you know, I mean, these are somewhere between 55 and 70-year-old folks. One was 85. I mean, video is not their thing. And to like try and make an opinion piece or an advocacy video was really not their thing. But what was their thing? Letters to the editor. They totally understood letters to the editor. They read them all the time. And so all I had to do, and it was so easy, to translate a letter to the editor and a digital storytelling script. They're pretty much the same, right?
Brilliant.
Short, personal, based on your lived experience, with an observation and a call to action. And
how did you think of that?
Well, because I started asking them where they get their news and their information and their opinions, and where do people turn to in their community to find out what other people think. And everyone said letters to the editor. Everyone read. You know, there's only 2,500 people in this huge alpine valley, but they all read the daily or weekly newspaper. I think it was weekly, and they went first to the letters to the editor. So it was something.
A physical newspaper.
Yeah, physical newspaper. Yeah, which you know, one thing I'll also add, since I have the soapbox here, is that while I have, for a lot of reasons, migrated a lot of my work online, I think it's really important to point out that in my experience, community change and individual change doesn't happen online. It happens face-to-face in bricks and mortar spaces.
Well, that's our last question here.
Oh.
We'll bring it up.
Yeah.
Could projects such as yours serve as the future of what we now consider the town hall meeting? And is the digital space the future of community, collaboration, and discussion?
I think for some time it won't be. One thing is that unless you're a millennial, it's not, you know, which is, so here in the United States, the vast majority of the population is actually boomers or older. And they're not necessarily going to the internet for their social and community outlets. So, and they're the people who are actually influencing policy most at this point. So for another 20 years, I think just by that fact alone, it's not the one place people are going to go. The other thing too is that even though there's a lot of ways, kind of like we're creating now, to have people engage across space and time and have people be able to come in when they want and how they want, I think that it's going to be vital to always have on-the-ground events paired with any online event. I think it engages different learning styles. It engages different literacies, different languages. And then again, there is something that is fundamentally, as someone who has a background in community organizing, I think that it's more effective in a shorter amount of time with less resources to do stuff on the ground than online. And because of that, we will always need to, not always, but at least for the next 25 years, I feel like if we're going to do inclusive, participatory stuff from rural to suburban to urban, we're always going to need to have on the ground paired with online.
Wow, Jessica, this is so great. So knowing that you have an audience of both the people that hopefully will be designing the campaigns, working with whatever is the future of these multimedia journalists, how do you see the two combining now that you're working in public radio? How can they talk to one another and really make powerful collaborations that work for citizens and bring them into this space, like you said?
Such a great question. You know, I was at a conference recently, and this great writer who you might know, Arlene Goldbard, used this term, fruitful friction. It's not easy to say, but fruitful friction. And I think that that it's going to take people who can remain curious and remain open in terms of their positions about how things should work and what journalism should be and how things are done, to actually work together and tussle through these tough questions to arrive at their own working process, and do that through some pilot experimental projects. And I think it's going to be a struggle. I do think it's going to be a struggle because I don't think most public media, let me back up. I think public media has developed a way of an operating culture that is not very inclusive and participatory and about public voice. I think it has a culture of, professionals determining what's true, accurate, and newsworthy. And I don't mean that to say that that's wrong. I just think that that's kind of a way these organizations work, which will rub up against, in a hard way, folks who come out of community organizing or social action, or who aren't the NPR or PBS demographic, which is kind of the vast majority at this point in the country. I think there's going to be some rubs, and I think that it's going to take people who are willing to sit at a table and keep working together to resolve, in the positive sense, resolve kind of somewhat competing and somewhat conflicting methodologies, and to try things. And I think that a lot of stations are doing that. And I just think it's going to be, it's just not going to be very smooth for a while. But I would say, and I might be being a little Pollyanna, but I think this is the cutting edge. And I think it's going to be the leading edge for a while. Because I think that people more and more want to have media be relevant, interesting, useful, and timely. And that means that their ideas and interests and needs need to be taken into account. And one of the ways to do that is engage them. Sure, we can have marketers go do polls. But if we want to kind of build organizations or build projects or build public media systems that people feel invested in and will invest in, then we're going to need to find and create new ways to involve people in a way that is meaningful to them. And I think that as much as we can learn from each other on how to do that and convince funders to fund us to do that, I think that's the next 10 years.
This is brilliant. Thank you so much. And I hope that everybody has stayed through the end of our conversation here, which has gone on for about 60 minutes. And do you have anything? I mean, that is really it. And I can't see any other way to really look at the symbiotic relationship now between participation, spreadability, and not the deprofessionalization of journalism, but the inclusoriness that you keep talking about, right? It's not us and them anymore.
Yeah, it's we.
Okay, great, Jessica. I'm going to turn off the recording right now.
Okay.
But we'll still be on. No, we're still on. Hold on.